So session 2 is entitled Benches to Bedsides, Stories and Strategies from Clinician-Scientists. So we're going to have 4 panelists join me on the stage here. I'll throw some questions at our panelists, but you'll be free as well to stick your hand up and throw questions at our people, because they've all got different stories to tell, different journeys, and they'll give you different advice as well. One of the things you will hear in your career is that there's no single pathway to success. There's many different pathways, so you'll hear a range of opinions, and there might even be disagreement on the panel. Let's hope so, because it's always more interesting when there is disagreement. So, first of all, Helen Benham, Associate Professor Helen Benham, you can come and join us, please. Executive Director of Translation at the TRI, and a Senior Staff Specialist Rheumatologist at the PA Hospital. So, welcome. We'll be peppering you. My next guest is Professor Kiarash Khosrotehrani, a colleague of mine from the world of skin cancer, someone I know very well, clinician-scientist, dermatologist, oncologist, molecular biologist, that sort of stuff. And he's also the St. Baker-Soyer Chair of Dermatology. Welcome, Kiarash. I'm just running down my list in no particular order. Dr. Philip Mosley. Phil is a neuropsychiatrist. He is a colleague at the QIMR Berghofer Research Institute and also a clinician now at the Lata Hospital and runs a private neuropsychiatry practice. So, Phil, welcome. And last but not least, an old classmate of mine from our first years in university together, Professor Lata Vadlamudi is a Senior Staff Specialist in Neurology at Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, but also in this setting is a researcher with a particular interest in epilepsy and is an epileptologist. And so you'll be sharing your views today from the Queensland Centre for Clinical Research, so University of Queensland Centre for Clinical Research. So welcome, Lata, as well. Okay, so we're all mic'd up, I hope, and everyone's audible. So my first question, let me run along the panel from that side to this side. I don't know if it's right or left. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your clinical and research journey so far? You've got a maximum of 2 minutes.
Okay. So my clinical research journey started with actually an MD PhD program. So I got into this MD PhD program second year of med school. So I grew up and trained in France. So over there, med school is 6 years and a bit different. But overall, you know, it's the passion for research grew really quickly, and you know, understanding that it requires dedication in time and so on, and so the PhD really culminated at the end of my specialty training. So it was quite a journey to get there, but I think, you know, it was important for me to find out what I wanted to do. And so, you know, I've always embraced maybe a slightly different model of what you've seen today, which is that, you know, being able to having the technical expertise and the knowledge to actually run my own lab at the same time as I'm doing clinical work. So that has been.
So briefly, medical degree, dermatology training, and then your PhD
and then
afterwards.
My PhD, yeah.
And your PhD, you did pipetting and lab sciencey stuff.
Yep. Yeah. So 3 years, actually took off to Boston so that I don't get called on stuff in the hospital, and then did just that.
Okay, brilliant. Great. We'll come back and explore some of those things. Helen, briefly, your life story.
So I am a rheumatologist, and at the end of my advanced training, I had done honours in medical school, but actually in an epidemiological project.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, apparently not. And then at the end of my advanced training, I had actually set up a clinical trials job to go and do in Cambridge in the UK. And I got railroaded, actually, by my now mentor, Professor Anjani Thomas, who is an immunologist, rheumatologist at the PA and UQ, Frazer Institute, who said, oh, no, Helen, I think you should, we know people over there, and I think that you should consider doing a PhD, a laboratory-based PhD, which I'd never considered before. anyway, I got completely railroaded and started a laboratory-based PhD in Cambridge, and I spent a year there in Professor Hill Gaston's lab, completely out of my depth, and came back and finished that PhD. As I had a couple of small children at the time, we could really only be in Cambridge for the year, and so I finished my PhD back at TRI, which is where the Frazer Institute is. It was the Diamantina Institute back at that time. And subsequently, I've actually had a checkered research career because I didn't stay in laboratory medicine, although I have a huge link to Ranjani's program of work and continue to be involved. But I subsequently did some postdoctoral stuff and did an NHMRC TRIP fellowship, which is the other end of the research spectrum in implementation and clinical research and clinical trials. And so I currently now do a little bit of research. I am a clinician, and I actually do quite a lot of executive and non-executive roles in research and innovation.
So wearing 3 hats currently.
Yep.
Busy. Okay. Phil, as a neuropsychiatrist, how did you get there?
Thanks, David. Well, I grew up in England and did a master's degree in neuroscience at the university where I went to medical school, which is Oxford, because I really couldn't decide whether I really preferred neurology or psychiatry all the way through. Just knew I was interested in the brain. Ended up coming out here, trained as a psychiatrist, got my fellowship, and then did a fellowship program in neuropsychiatry at the Royal Brisbane. Again, was just really, really loving it. And one of my mentors at the time said, "You're doing all this extra work and study, and you've got all these ideas. Why don't you do a PhD? Because you're doing all the work anyway." And basically the problem was I was in a deep brain stimulation team as a psychiatrist and for Parkinson's disease, and a large proportion of our patients were, having some significant mental health problems after we implanted the electrodes and turned on the stimulation, and I was trying to work out why this was happening. And so I did a PhD, a QIMR Berghofer, and then that sort of launched into a clinical research career, and I've just kind of kept the ball rolling and combining my interests in neuroscience and psychiatry, and it's just kind of something that's kept its momentum going, and I've been lucky, applied for millions and millions of grants and got some, and that's allowed me to keep doing research, and it's really become my sort of passion now, and my clinical work, I think it's really nice because I found myself working predominantly in neurology services in teams implanting deep brain stimulation devices and doing other forms of neurostimulation, and it's just really interesting and cool.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, thank you. And Lata, you're not so far away from Philip's area of the brain.
But now, just to start, my story is quite different to all of yours. So, I never, ever thought I'd be a researcher. I went into med school, I did medicine. Then I actually came out, became a GP, and then I thought, I want to be good at something. And then I actually came back and did my fellowship and became a neurologist.
So how long were you a GP for? Sorry,
About 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
2 or 3, and then I came back and completed my fellowship, did all the things I was meant to do. I went overseas, got lots of, a lot of clinical practice. And then I was actually due to go back, and then a gentleman, Sam Berghofer, he was actually my PhD, so he came up to me one day at a meeting and said, "Do you want to do a PhD with me?" And I sort of thought about it. It was one of those moments where you make a decision, and I went down there and we did a clinical fellowship. Because I'm clinically trained, I'm not a lab person, I've never actually done any lab work. And I did a clinical fellowship with him and with Ingrid Scheffer, who became the 2 probably most prominent people over the next sort of, decade and a half. So that's how it started. And, it's been an interesting journey because I never thought that PhD time would be, one of the best years of my life. It still is. And it sort of led me on this completely different journey, which I never thought I was going to travel. And I love it. I call it a hobby. I do, because I just love the research. It's such a different hat. And you put it on and you think about things in a different way. Currently, I do clinical work and use my patients as my inspiration. And then, I then sort of think about it as research. Mind you, there's many ups and downs. I'm sure we'll talk about the research. But I guess that's how it just motivates me to keep on this journey of why I love the research so much.
So this has been very interesting. You've heard people doing their PhDs at quite different stages of their career. So, Kiarash, for you, it was early in your training.
So the basic science training was quite early.
Yeah.
But I actually didn't enjoy one of the problems I had with the MD PhD program, the way it was set up, is that it was too intercalated. So, and maybe boys are different, but we need to do one thing at a time. and so I couldn't enjoy it the way, and it was really, so I decided to actually interrupt, focus only on medicine, and then have, years of science intercalated. But then when I finished my specialty, I spent 3 years, and as you were saying, this was really a great time, where you just dedicate time to your research. You don't have to worry about the phone ringing and running into the hospital and things like that. So that was, that was really. The other important thing is also to, if you know what you want to do for your specialty, probably you can do your PhD at any time. But if you're not yet set in, which career path you're going to go, maybe it's good to push it a bit back and figure out. I think, somehow it's, for a clinician-scientist, it's always good if your PhD is related to your clinical practice down the track.
So I wanted to ask each of you about significant moments or significant people in your careers who guided you or inspired you. Maybe I'll start with Lata, because you mentioned a couple of names there. Ingrid Scheffer, who's a past president of this academy, who has inspired lots of people, but clearly inspired you. Do you want to flesh that out a little bit? How did that come about? How did you become in her orbit, or how did she influence you?
I did my PhD with Sam Berghofer,
Yep.
who's Ingrid did her PhD with.
Okay.
So, and that's how I met Ingrid, because of the research team. I was in Melbourne for 3 years, and so I got to know Ingrid very well, who became, extraordinarily, obviously so impressive in her own right, but as a person and as someone who I've talked to over the years many a times when I've sort of been calling for help, or if I've been, feeling I've got to throw it all in. So she's always, and just to have a couple of people that have consistently over the last, 10, 20 years been there for me, and I know I can just pick up the phone and say, what do you think? What should I do? So I think that's been a huge part. I think your supervisor, the team that you're working in at that initial stages is really, I think, what's always inspired me, the quality of the researchers I've worked with.
Thanks. Phil?
Yeah, I think I would agree completely. The chap who was my primary PhD supervisor was kind of on my wavelength. He was quite laid back and not kind of a type A personality, but really supportive and extremely smart, and also a fantastic networker. So, for example, I ended up doing projects examining the kind of the mathematical basis of decision making in the human brain, and he said, "Oh, look, this is probably I'm not right on the money on this, but I'm going to call up the phone. I'm going to speak to my mate Klaas, who's in Switzerland," and I ended up flying off to Switzerland for a bit and spending some time there in a neuroscience lab, just skilling up on mathematical ways of modelling brain activity, and so he was really a kind of fixer for me. He just I'd come to him with a problem and he'd be like, "Right, well, we're going to do this, this and this, and I'm going to help you sort it out." So that was really beneficial, I think.
And do you stay in touch with these mentors to this day?
With Michael, of course, yeah. Mainly, we've got a good relationship, so mostly we send each other banter over email and mobile. But yeah, definitely, he's still
stay in touch. Yeah.
Regard him as a friend, really.
Okay, excellent. And Helen, you mentioned the word railroaded, so that sounds like it was a more directed bit of mentoring to...
Well, I don't know if any of you know Professor Anjani Thomas, but that's, how she rolls.
Yeah.
And I'm really grateful for that. Yeah. But
so would you have gone into research if Ranjani hadn't planted that seed, or?
I'm not sure. I mean, like I said, I was going to do a clinical trials fellowship job. At the time, rheumatology was really exploding with all of the new biologic DMARDs, and that was my interest.
Yep.
And Ranjani's proposition, well, that's immunology. If you're interested in that, actually, you know, let's do this. And I'm forever grateful for both Ranjani's power of suggestion. There was, my other supervisor was a guy called Professor Matt Brown, who equally, you know, a giant in our field of rheumatology, and Hill Gaston, the professor that I went to in Cambridge. You know, I just felt very inspired by them, but equally, particularly Ranjani is an eternal optimist, right? That is potentially her greatest capacity. And in research, you need that. You know, that's kind of the linchpin to me to keep going in research. But I think along the way, what has happened, at least for me, is that I seem to have accrued all of these, which is what happens in research. It's the team sport, right? So you meet people and you become both friends and colleagues and mentors you collect along the way, and that's definitely been my experience in research. It's something that adds to your clinical realm, that's different, you know, and those people are different.
And so, Kiarash, lastly, you've been in 3 continents now in your career, so you must have, I presume you have mentors or have had mentors along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, there's, I would say there's even not just mentors, but there's people you get inspired by. You know, there's one category which is just for inspiration, not necessarily people that you know very well. You know, in my case, there was a professor of developmental biology at where I used to work at École Normale Supérieure in Paris. So he was a dermatologist. He had stopped to his dermatology work to just do regenerative medicine, and he was in the team that identified the first epidermal stem cells that then went and became the common treatment for burns. So, you know, you see people like that, and you're like, well, this is really coming from a developmental biology question, and then it has such an implication down the track, and so these stories inspire you, and then you have, you know, I had my mentors in France who, you know, really with whom we worked, established labs and so on. In the US, obviously my PhD supervisors here, you know, Baker-Soyer, Adele Green, great people to work with, and so yeah, I think, you know, along your journey, you need probably different people to inspire you and to mentor you.
Great. Now, a few times the word challenge has been mentioned today and in this discussion. So I presume, and you, Helen, you mentioned the word optimism. Presumably that's to overcome these challenges. Maybe you could just share, each of you, some of the challenges you've had to overcome, and maybe share how you managed to overcome them. So Lata, can I start with you? I'll put you on the spot.
The biggest challenge, I think, for me was, you know, and this is if, you know, if you're wanting to have kids, is having kids. And you're sort of at a point, I had done my PhD, you know, research was going well. I was, you know, with this amazing team, trajectory was going like this. And then probably for 10 years, I had very high risk pregnancies, illnesses. It all changed because something far more important was happening. So 10 years pretty much out of my life was, you know, getting, you know, 2 kids healthy and into this world. So then coming back, and my biggest challenge was coming back. I'd sort of left Melbourne. I was here trying to start on my own, trying to create something. Already when you come back after maternity leave, you sort of, you lose your confidence too in your clinical work, and so you sort of start behind the 8 ball, and you're trying really hard to build up your confidence, telling people you've had career disruptions. They're going, where are your publications? And then the career disruption holds on with you for many years prior, and so to rebuild that has been my biggest challenge, to sort of get past that, build, create, and the many a times I wanted to give this up. There was many times, and that's why, you know, do an emergency call to Ingrid and say, look, it's all just too hard. And I think that, and when I talk to my younger colleagues, that's what I talk about. It's, you know, you've got to just do this, your own journey. And as a female, if you want to have kids, you just, and I know, Vicky, you mentioned this too, things happen, unexpected happen, and you You just got to try and make it work for you and not compare yourself. Like I was looking at David, look at David, I was looking at him same year. You're amazing in your research, and I was just here going, what have I done, and so I think that was my biggest challenge.
Yeah, but you clearly confronted the challenge and have had support along the way.
That's right, and and the support's been amazing, and then you also get an understanding of who you are and what you can do. And if you want to do this, you're going to do it in your own way.
Yeah. So that's a very positive message. Phil, challenges.
Yeah, I think one of my clinical supervisors said to me once that medicine is an exercise in delayed gratification, and I think doing a PhD and a research career is just an extension of that, really. And there are many days where I've woken up and I said, "What am I doing? Like, like one of my best jobs ever was in summer of university. I used to be a labourer on a building site and just get up, shovel a pile of dirt from there to there, mix some concrete and have a nice cup of coffee and then go home. Why am I not doing that? But then actually I think about it and I think, actually, no, this is actually really cool. It's really interesting science. It's making a difference. And it's what I've been interested in since I was a kid. So just, deal with it. But actually it's not that hard to do that, because when you think about it, it takes a long time, but you're solving fundamental problems and making a real difference to the wealth of human understanding of medical conditions, and that's really powerful, I think.
Thank you. Helen, challenges?
I think my biggest challenge over the years since doing research has been the challenge related to clinical work. So I have always loved being a doctor, and the clinical work to me is probably the thing that I enjoy the most, to be perfectly frank. Yet I wanted to do all of this other stuff, and I've always found it hard to feel like a real clinician amongst my peers, particularly when it comes to inpatient and acute medicine. Even though I'm a rheumatologist, you'd think there's not much to that. Actually, there is, and I have along the way often felt like I'm not part of either tribe, that you have a feeling that when you're with your clinicians, they see you as different. And I've always struggled with the fractions, how much clinical work is enough, how much is enough for me to feel like I am at the top of my game as a clinician versus what I actually need to do for the research and how much time I need to put to that. So my biggest challenge has been that balance, actually, and I still struggle with that now, to be honest. It hasn't gone away.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're describing that imposter syndrome where you feel that you're not equipped in the situation that you're in. And yet I think all of us feel that all the way through our journey. Even getting into medical school, you think, I don't deserve to be in medical school, and I don't deserve to be at university, and then you graduate and they're calling me a doctor now and I'm supposed to be able to fix people, and then I'm a specialist, and then I'm a world leader in my field, and all the time you have that imposter.
But there's a degree of not just imposter, but a degree of belief that you need to do a certain amount of clinical time to be at the top of your game. Yeah. And I've worked all sorts of different fractional appointments, nothing at all research, a day of research, 4 days of clinical, and everything in between with kids and maternity leave and various other things. And I don't know what the right amount is, but I do know that if I am underneath a value of about a day and a half of clinical practice, I feel underdone personally. But also the connection that you have with your clinical tribe, because that medicine's there's no getting away from the fact that medicine is quite tribal, and then your research colleagues are different, and there have definitely been times where I wondered where I was and where I best fit.
Thank you. Kiarash.
No, I do relate to that. I think, in early years of my specialty training, I would not say that I do science, because expectations change from you. Look, I was going to say time, but also, I think the challenge, biggest challenge more for me was to fund my journey. I think when you add, these are extra years of university and extra years of training and travel, to the States, so I think that was the biggest challenge to try to actually do that on low dollars.
So I will remind people, you are free to ask any questions. So if I have my back to you, please try and alert one of our microphone holders. But if you have any questions of our panel, do shout them out, because you won't be alone in thinking of your question at all. So you've all talked about different challenges. Kiarash, you just raised the issue of time management, but it's the question I get asked all the time, and I'm not a clinician anymore at all. So I want to ask you clinicians and clinician-scientists, how do you manage that demand on your time, both your work time and your non-work time? How do you put it all together and stay healthy? Lata, can you share your insights?
Yeah, that is probably the biggest challenge over the years, and currently now, and it's different to what it was a decade ago, everything's integrated. Like I do probably 3 days a week, 3.5 days of clinical, and I'll be doing on-call and the whole clinical bit, and then I have to have roughly 2 days of research. And now for me, everything is just all entwined. I might be in the middle of a clinic and I might be doing something research. It's just all merged, everything just, but 10 years ago, it's really hard. If you want to make a start in the research, you need that dedicated time. You just can't be interrupted every 5 minutes by this patient, and so I think the first thing is trying to carve out some time away from clinical work with a fellowship, or trying to get, and that was the biggest privilege I had on the Metro North Clinician Research Fellowship, where I had 2 days free where I could just focus on the research.
That was actually Scott Bell who brought those in.
Yes.
So Scott, who was our first speaker, when in one of the
Yes.
hats he was wearing at Metro North,
He
brought in
was.
those
That's right.
fellowships for that reason.
And they were just, it was just probably the best thing that ever gave me in the last few years, was to have 2 days where I could actually have thinking space, where I could create connections, get to know people. And once you've got that built and established, it's easier then to integrate the way I have. But I think that is the constant juggle. I am a clinician like you, Helen. Clinical work is me, and I always have done clinical research. So that part of me, I need that to integrate with the research. So I kind of want to make it work where I'm quite active in the department, plus have my clinical research hat on as well.
So protected time.
Yes.
Now, Phil, you do private and public and research, don't you?
I do at the moment.
Does it work for you?
No, it's a complete disaster. Don't ever do that.
Very frank and honest accounting. Thank you.
So my journey is a bit unique because I was working in the largest deep brain stimulation team in Australia as the psychiatrist, so it sort of gelled very nicely with the research I was doing into deep brain stimulation and neuropsychiatric symptoms. So that kind of worked well. But being a private psychiatrist, I was the only psychiatrist covering a large tertiary referral hospital. So we, gastro, orthopedics, neurology, cardiology, major cardiology centre actually. And so the phone just goes off all the time. And so exactly like we've heard, I needed to try and carve out some days. Initially, I was still employed by Queensland Health and seconded to this hospital, and Queensland Health generously decided not to pay me any wages on a Friday so that I could just dedicate that to research and sit down at the desk and actually think. And then I was very lucky. Eventually, I ended up getting some grants from various places, so I could actually have some money coming in on those days, which is always helpful. And that's still the way I kind of try and manage things now, even though I'm not a Queensland Health employee anymore. I have to, I need a run up to get thinking at stuff. So I have to have at least a day a week where I'm not seeing patients, where I'm not in a clinic, and I can just sit down with my computer and my work and say, right, what we're doing, let's just focus on this for a whole day and try and get the ball rolling.
Helen, you mentioned a little bit about time management before. Do you want to expand a bit on how you...
I can relate. You know, I'm happy to tell the story that when I finished my PhD, you know, as a family unit, we had run out of money. And so I did do private for a few years and public. So I had a fractional public appointment, and I worked a day and a half privately, and I was doing research as well. And I crazily took a role, clinical school role with UQ at PA. And it was too much. It was quite clear after a couple of years that that was just crazy town.
A couple of years?
Yes.
That long?
And, you know, and then, you know, at various points along the way, you've got to decide what you don't do, right?
Yeah.
Which is the hardest thing for me, actually. What it is, not what to do, but actually not what to do. What not to do. I ended up giving up the private work. To the disappointment of my non-medical husband, because I just couldn't do it all. Yeah. Because you actually have multiple workplaces and you have multiple tasks that outside the actual clinical and the other stuff are just, there's so many layers when you've got multiple positions. And then what happened also is that I got an NHMRC fellowship, which bought out 0.5 of my time, and finally I had this protected kind of space, which is a common theme for everybody, and so I could readjust. So, now, yeah.
Can I just ask there, because you know that had a happy ending there with that NHMRC fellowship, so that was excellent. But as you were making that decision to drop something, how did that make you feel, and how did you work out what to drop?
I found it really difficult. Again, I had this sense of I'm opting out of clinical practice. You know, and then I had accrued, you know, rheumatology is a specialty where you keep patients, right? That's one of the joys of the specialty, is that you follow people a long time, chronic diseases without current cure, on lifelong medicines. But the reality of that is after a couple of years in private practice, you have all of these patients who, for want of a better term, you own, right? They're reliant on you. And I found it really difficult to say to all of them. In fact, one of the worst couple of weeks of my clinical career was patient after patient walking in and saying, I'm so sorry, but I'm leaving private practice. And perhaps that's the reason why I would never go back to private, because I found the connection hard to break. In public land, there's a shared care delivery, generally speaking, and you know, for me that fits better. But yeah, that was hard.
No, that's tough. Thank you for sharing that. Kiarash, time management. You're now wearing multiple hats as an administrator, a researcher,
That's
a
right.
clinician.
Well, my primary appointment is at UQ, so I'm mostly and nearly full-time a UQ researcher. So and I have these other appointments which are fractional in the hospital and also not in private but in the Skin and Cancer Foundation. I think you know you'll find that over time you probably really need to dedicate a big chunk of your time when you get into research to actually understand your field, understand the technology, be really proficient at it, and as you go along, that requirement becomes less and less. I think you know you probably feel comfortable even in a 1 day a week or 2 days a week to be able to even do something really complex in the lab, because you have that knowledge now, you have that confidence to take it there. And I think you know that's been sort of what I've learned. You know, as you build your confidence, you don't need as much time for, but then other things are thrown at you.
Now I can see we've got an audience question here, so please, maybe say your name and then ask your question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen. I'm a neonatologist who is about 6 months into her PhD. And one thing that I've found kind of interesting is since going part-time clinical, full-time PhD, I've had a lot of other clinicians say to me, well, why are you doing that? And despite being in a very evidence-based, research-heavy field, people don't really seem to understand why I want to do a PhD. And one person very cleverly told me it's all about selling the transferable skills. So I was just wondering what you guys see as the transferable skills between research and clinical practice, and how do you market your research skills in your sort of clinical domain?
That's a great question. I wish I'd thought of it. Thank you. Maybe, who wants to take it?
I'll take it.
Phil.
That's a great question. I don't do it at all. I did my PhD because there was a clinical problem that I was really interested in solving, and I'm a mechanistic kind of person. So I was in a DBS team, and we implanted these electrodes in people with Parkinson's disease. A large proportion of them were going, for want of a better word, crazy, and having some awful outcomes in the psychiatric domain. They're splitting up with their partners. They were spending their money at the casino. They were being arrested for dangerous driving. And these are older people who you're trying to help. And so that's why I did my PhD. I had a problem to solve, and I was really interested in it. And doing a PhD gave me the facilities and the backing to try and improve the clinical care that we deliver these people. And that's what we've done. So using the methods that I developed in my PhD, we now map the precise position of all the electrodes that we implant in the brains of these people, so that we know exactly which connections to optimize with the stimulation, so we avoid this problem from happening now. So we make a transferable difference to people who are suffering, and they can get the benefit that we want them to get from this advanced therapy. And that's the outcome for me. I don't think it's ever been about transferable skills or career options. It's just been, for me, about having a problem that you can solve and having a benefit for patients.
That's played with a straight bat there. So
I'm the opposite almost, because my PhD, I don't really use the skills that I gained in my PhD, which is a basic science immunology PhD. But I feel like that PhD has given me more than any of the other training I received across the years, because it taught me to write, a skill that I didn't particularly have before I did my PhD. Researchers taught me how to appraise huge amounts of data, which I now use in my board roles. Like I can get through 300 or 400 board papers, and that is related to my ability that I learn in research to be able to get through data and get to the point, right? And pull out and extract what matters and actually what doesn't. And so I feel like research gave me all of these transferable skills that I never knew I was going to have, I might add. So it's not like I went in knowing that that would happen, but it definitely did happen. Yeah.
Phil, would you agree with those?
Well, I think I was actually thinking about a response to this. Glad you asked me. I think we may be in different orbits. That's the kind of thing.
Yeah.
So in my career as a psychiatrist, if you want to be really successful, and this is not a diss of any of my psychiatry colleagues, who of course I all respect, but if you want to be successful as a psychiatrist, you go private practice, you work at a private hospital, you have some kind of administrative role, and it's really about it's not about science or treatment pathways. It's about cranking through the patients, taking a cut of all the patients that are seen, and then you make lots of money, right? So I'm not interested in that at all. And that's not all psychiatrists, of course. And there are many psychiatrists like me who are actually trying to solve problems. But yeah, I think perhaps our worlds are different.
And that's why we have a diverse panel. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Kiarash, did you want to respond?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think part of it is really cultural, and other parts of the world, you cannot have a public teaching hospital appointment if you're not a clinician-scientist. And I think
that's the case in France.
In France, in lots of lots of parts of the US, in UK, and so on. So there's excellent clinicians who don't have a PhD. So really, I would never try to make a case that you need to have a PhD to be a good clinician. That's not the point. But it's really about how do you progress the field? How do you make impact? As they were saying, this is where a PhD. Well, you can see as many patients as you want in your career. firstly, after your first 10 years, they're going to become redundant. You've seen it a bit all, but then this is how you make impact in the field, and this is how you change practice and for the better.
And Lata, what skills from your PhD have transferred into your clinical work?
Yeah, I agree with what Helen said. You learn a lot of new skills that you never had and you never knew you were going to learn. And I always think everything you do helps you. And ultimately, if you're a clinician, you want to be a better clinician. And I think you want to change paradigms. I think someone once said to me, don't be the taker of knowledge, be the maker of knowledge. So you want to make knowledge. I mean, for instance, in epilepsy, 30% are drug resistant. So you happily just say, I can try this tablet, but can we make it better? So you're trying to help outcomes and impacts. Can you improve care for your patients? So I think that is the transferable, the inspiration is your patient.
Did that answer your question? Yeah. Have you learned skills so far that you can transfer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to have an interesting question or create an interesting question in the first place and then know how to answer it and know how to attack the problem. I think, that's something that I think I'm going to get at doing a PhD, which is the reason why I'm doing it. But it's just interesting, like you said, there's a different culture in different places. And even other parts of Australia, I think, are much better at recognizing the value of the PhD. But it's just an interesting response that I've had.
Yeah. I think the reading and writing skills are really something that we don't value as much, but we do actually gain a lot. You just can't help but read a lot when you're doing a PhD and write a lot. So that's amazing. Communication skills are important. Catherine's pointing to the mic, and the mic is here. Second row, far away.
How's it going? My name's Matthew. I'm currently a third-year medical student. And just to frame the question, I'll give you a little bit of background. So I come from a research background where I did an honours year in respiratory immunology, kind of more lab-based, like in vitro models, and then worked as an RA for a year before medical school in genetic engineering kind of stuff. So my question is two-part. The first is I want to get a little bit more involved in clinical research. So how can I go about approaching clinical research as I'm kind of transitioning these clinical years and getting ready for intern years? And then my second question, which is a bit challenging because everyone's obviously had quite different journeys, but how can you approach, or what parts of your career do you think is important to build those more research-based skills versus focusing on your more clinical years of building your skills as a clinician? I guess, what parts are important to focus on one versus the other, which is hard, but yeah.
Okay, so we've got a two-parter there, two-parter from Matthew. Transitioning your research skills before you get into your intern year, and then the second one, at what stage in your career really should you ramp up the research? Okay, Kiarash, do you want to...
Can I go? I mean, great question. I think in your question you asked about clinical research. You have lab skills. I would not count out, biology and molecular biology. There's such a change in biological sciences in the past years. With a lot of new technologies that are coming up that allow us to address a lot of new things that we could not even dream of. So people who have lab skills, I think you should harness them. And so for when to do this, it's really variable. It's again, I would still say if you know which specialty or what type of practice you want to have in the future, you can do it a bit sooner. But I would say probably find your interest first and your area of where you want to develop first. So in dermatology, for example, we have usually a big gap between the end of med school and entry into specialty, and that's usually a good time. This is usually 5 to 7 years. It's usually a good time to get engaged in research and do your PhD. So you really have that amount of time to really build up.
And one thing I would say is don't be afraid to reach out to people. So Scott Bell, who gave his presentation this morning, respiratory physician, sounds like you've got an interest in respiratory potentially, maybe. But talk to people, drop them emails, people will get back to you, and if they don't, well, that's okay, find the next one. But
Sorry, yeah, and I forgot that. Yeah, so absolutely. So there's also this opportunity within your, at least to have little short stays in different labs to just figure out, what you want to, what type of research you're interested in. Yeah, we have a lot of, students like that from med school coming and just having short stays. I had organized that for at UQ. I think that's very helpful, and a number of them actually stay on for PhDs afterwards.
Now, I'm really sorry, but I've done a terrible job of watching my watch, and I think Catherine's giving me the wind-up. So we've all had such a lovely time up here chatting away. So so I know there might be other questions, but you can catch people after we break. But I'd like to just close out by asking you each, you've all got different careers. Tell me what the best part of your career is, where you are now.
I think it's having two hats. I love my clinical work, I am a clinician, and then also having a research hat and being able, using my patients, so they are I do call them my inspirations, they make me think about my research. But I think over the last few years, one of these things has been the connections that I've made, working with basic scientists, learning, what they're doing, and between us, it's like a synergy. They learn about what's happening out in the clinical space, and I learn about what they're doing. So just making those connections, building collaborations, and I love going to the meetings with all the researchers and hearing about what's going on. I think that is the highlight for me, just that diversity.
Diversity, fabulous. Phil?
I think I'd agree with that 100%, actually. It's better than I could have put it. It's contributing to the quantum of human knowledge is such a privilege to even take a run at, whether or not you succeed in doing it. And as a clinician researcher, you have the best of both worlds. You have the interactions with patients, you learn about what they're really struggling with, and you can then use that and your medical knowledge to try and furnish new treatment options or therapies for these people.
Super. Helen?
Oh my goodness, I just agree with both of you. Like diversity and purpose, that's just everything that it's given to me, really, and continues to. And I guess the continue, for me at least, I think it's lots of doors continue to open for me, and I wouldn't have that without being a clinician researcher.
Kiarash?
Totally agree with that. I would add one more thing, is that as a scientist, you become part of an international tribe. And this is really the most, I think, this is for me the most rewarding, is like you have now friends and colleagues in all parts of the world, and then every conference you go to, you're all working on the same. Sometimes they're competitors, sometimes, and then they're initially all competitors, and then they become friends over time. And so I think that's exciting, because you see the evolution of the knowledge, collectively, and your work with all these experts. I think that's exciting.
I think that's very real. I think clinician scientists and researchers are a bit of a threatened species. So I think people do come together internationally. The camaraderie is an incredible thing, and as people here were saying, the contribution to knowledge is such a privilege. So. Well, look, you've heard a lot of opinions today. We could have talked for many hours, but please join with me in thanking my guests, Lata, Phil, Helen, and Kiarash, for your splendid insights. So thank you very much.